Hi, welcome to Forward Community Church Children's Ministries. I'm here today with Bubbles to continue our story about Joseph. Bubbles was really hungry and wanting a snack, so I told him if he hung out there and was good, he could have a bowl of cereal later. So are you ready to listen, Bubbles? Okay, well, last week we learned that Joseph was the youngest brother of 12 brothers. He was his father's favorite son. He gave him a special coat to set him apart from the rest of his brothers. Joseph had a couple of dreams, and in those dreams it was apparent that his brothers and his father and mother were worshiping him. They were bowing down to him, and he was set over them. And because of this, his brothers hated him. One day his father sent him out to check on them. They were deciding whether they were going to kill him or what, and they ended up throwing him in a pit. They ended up selling him to some traders that came by for a slave. And those traders took him into Egypt and sold him as a slave. The brothers took his coat, they took it back to his father, and they said, "I think maybe Joseph has died. Is this Joseph's coat?" And his father said, "Yes, it was." And his father was so sad because he thought his son was dead. Well, that's where our story picks up today. Joseph is in Egypt. He was sold to a man named Potiphar, who was an important man in the kingdom of Egypt. Our Bible verse for today comes from Genesis 50:20. It says, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about, as it is this day, to save many people alive." So here's Joseph. He's in Egypt, sold as a slave. He went from being the favorite son of his father, having basically everything he wanted, to being a slave. Joseph could have, at this point, said, "You know what? This isn't fair. I'm going to do my worst job. I'm not going to be a very good slave." He could have been really mad. He had been wronged here. His brothers did bad things to him. He didn't deserve this. And here he was in a faraway country with nothing. Instead, it tells us that Joseph did his best. He was faithful in everything that Potiphar put into his hand. And as a little bit of time went on, Potiphar saw that everything that Joseph did turned out good. God blessed everything he put his hand to. Potiphar gave Joseph charge over everything in his household. He was in charge of all his stuff. He was in charge of the food, cooking the meals, keeping the house clean, over all the other servants. Joseph was the head servant. One day, Potiphar's wife catches Joseph alone, and she wants him to take the place of her husband. And he knows this is not what God wants. Says no, and he runs away. But as he's running away, she grabs a hold of his cloak, and it rips off in her hand as he's running away. Well, she hangs on to this, and when her husband comes home, she says, "Look what your servant did. He tried to attack me, and I grabbed his cloak and screamed, and he ran away. You need to take care of that servant." He had to do something with Joseph. He couldn't let that happen. There were basically two choices. He could have had Joseph put to death, or he could have put Joseph in prison. And he chose to put Joseph in prison. When Joseph came into Potiphar's household, Potiphar saw that God blessed everything Joseph did, and that Joseph was a very faithful, honest individual. I think that Potiphar probably believed Joseph, but in this particular case, he had to take the side of his wife, because there was no way to prove either way. And, a slave or his wife, he had to choose the side of his wife, even though he probably believed that this honest man that he obviously trusted and had a good relationship with didn't do these things. Well, now Joseph had gone from being a favorite son to a slave to a prisoner in the dungeon. He could have curled up in the corner of the dungeon. He could have been really angry, and angry at his brothers, angry at Potiphar, angry at Potiphar's wife. The Bible doesn't mention any of that. Instead, what it mentions is that Joseph, when he was put in prison, he did his best and he was faithful in prison. Guess what happened? The jailer took notice of Joseph, saw that Joseph was faithful in everything that he did. Maybe Joseph straightened his jail cell every day, made sure everything was neat. He cleaned what he was in charge of up, and he lived an orderly life, and the jailer noticed this. And he started putting Joseph in charge of more and more things until the entire jail was under Joseph's leadership. He was in charge of everything. The jailer, again, just like Potiphar had, basically entrusted everything in the jail to Joseph's hand. One day, Joseph is going about his chores, and he sees a couple of new prisoners in the jail. He doesn't know who they are, but they look really sad, so he approaches them, asks them, "What's wrong, guys? Why are you so sad?" They said, "Well, we had dreams. Each of us had a dream, and there's nobody here who can tell us what those dreams mean, and it's troubling us because we don't know. We want to know." Joseph said, "Well, I can't guarantee you that God will tell me your dreams, but go ahead and tell them to me, and I'll see what he says." It turns out that the two people were the Pharaoh's butler and the Pharaoh's baker. Joseph listened, and he said to the butler, "This is your dream. In 3 days, God is going to take you out of this prison, and he's going to put you back in Pharaoh's service. You will again serve Pharaoh his cup. Whenever you go, please remember me here. Tell Pharaoh about me and get me out of this prison." Then he told the baker his dream. The baker's dream meant that in 3 days, Pharaoh was going to take him out of the prison too, but he was going to take him off and have him executed. He was going to be killed. Well, 3 days came, and both of them were taken out, and it happened just like Joseph had told him. The butler was restored, and the baker was killed. But the butler forgot Joseph, didn't mention him at all to Pharaoh. Time went on, and then one night, Pharaoh had a dream. And this dream upset him so much that he couldn't sleep anymore, and he called all of his wise men, and he told them his dream, and they couldn't interpret the dream. Nobody knew what it meant. Then the butler remembered that there was this slave in prison who had told him his dream, and it had happened just like he had told him. So he told Pharaoh about Joseph, and Pharaoh called for Joseph to be brought out of the prison. Joseph came in before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh told him his dreams. He said that in his first dream, there were 7 ears of grain that were really big and fat and healthy and produced a lot of grain. And then after them sprung up 7 really bad ears, so bad you couldn't eat them. The bad ears ate the good ears, and they were still skinny and bad. He fell asleep again and had another dream, and 7 big fat cows came out of the Nile River. And they were really big and healthy and fat. And then out of the Nile River came 7 skinny bad cows that looked really sick. And they ate the fat cows and were still skinny. Joseph asked God what it meant, and God told him. Joseph told Pharaoh, and he said, "These 2 dreams are really the same dream. It means that for 7 years, there will be a huge harvest in the land. You'll get lots and lots and lots of food. And then after that, there will be 7 years where you won't be able to harvest anything. Nothing will grow, and there will be famine." Pharaoh asked Joseph, "Well, what should we do?" And Joseph's advice was, "We should set someone over the kingdom so that they can gather in the extra grain for the first 7 years and store it so that whenever the bad 7 years come, we can have food to eat." Then Pharaoh turned to Joseph. He said, "If God revealed to you the dream, if you know the meaning of it, you are that person that should be doing this." So Pharaoh made Joseph second in command in Egypt. Pharaoh was the only one more powerful than Joseph. He was in charge of all the production of Egypt. God had been planning this all along. He took Joseph from being a slave in prison all the way up to the second most powerful person in the most powerful country on earth. Egypt was the world superpower at that time. He put him in charge of gathering all the grain. Started being a good, faithful administrator like he'd been so many times already in his life. He built storehouses to store the grain. He made the people of Egypt bring some of their grain in, and he would store it. They started counting it, but at some point, there was so much grain they just gave up counting. We can see here that God had a plan and a purpose. He chose Joseph. You know, he could have chosen one of Joseph's brothers, but God looked at Joseph's heart, and he looked at the hearts of his brothers. Even though his brothers bullied him and stuff, Joseph still took care of his brothers. He didn't fight back against them. He prayed for his brothers. Joseph would be faithful to get into that position that God wanted him in. God provided so much grain in those 7 years. And then the 7 years were over, and the bad 7 years started. In those bad 7 years, nothing would grow. Famine was all over the area, even in Canaan. Everybody was getting hungry, and they started coming to Joseph in Egypt and saying, "Can we buy food?" So Joseph set up stations selling food, and he would interview people who came from faraway countries to buy food. One day Joseph is sitting on his chair selling food to people who came from far lands, and guess who he sees come in the door? He sees 10 of his brothers, and he recognizes them. But of course, they don't recognize Joseph. Joseph was a little boy, sold as a slave. This ruler of Egypt can't possibly be Joseph. That doesn't even cross their mind. I'm sure Joseph at this point has just so much emotion. His brothers that he's missed, his family, he loved them. I'm sure he laid in prison and cried, missing them. But he also has some bad feelings about his brothers because they hurt him. They sold him into slavery. They were mean to him. But he wants to test them. He wants to see if their hearts have changed. So he calls them before him and he says, "You guys are spies." He talks mean to them. "I don't believe your story. You say you have a father? You have another brother? Well, I don't think I believe you. I'm going to keep one of you as a hostage. I'm going to give you grain, and I'm going to send you back. And next time you come, if you want to talk to me, you need to bring your youngest brother, Benjamin." Joseph's brothers didn't recognize this man at all. They had no idea that this was Joseph. So they took their grain, and they left Simeon, one of their brothers, behind, and they went back to their father. Joseph did a little trick on them. He took the money that they had paid for the grain and he hid it in their bag to see what they would do. Some time went by. They didn't want to go back to Egypt because they were afraid what might happen, but they ran out of food and they had to go back. His brothers had talked to their dad. The dad knew that Joseph, although he didn't know it was Joseph, wanted them to bring his youngest, his new favorite son, Benjamin, to Egypt with them. Jacob had already lost one of his sons. He'd already lost Joseph. He did not want to lose Benjamin as well. He really didn't have a choice though. It was either send Benjamin off and risk him, or they were going to starve to death. We sent all the 10 brothers back to Egypt. As they got there, they went before Joseph and they said, "Sir, our money was in our bag last time. We don't know what happened, but here's the money we had paid before and here's more money." Joseph said, I got your money before. I don't know what happened. I guess God put it in your bag." That night, Joseph throws a big party, invites his brothers to a feast, and he returns Simeon to them. They eat lots of food, and they're kind of wondering what's going on here. What really is this? Joseph was really excited to see Benjamin because those two brothers were close. But they still don't know who Joseph is. They still think that he is just a ruler. Even Benjamin was kind of confused about why he needs to go to Egypt. They finish the feast, and the next day they get up early, they pack their bags, and Joseph tells his servants to hide Joseph's special silver cup inside of Benjamin's bag. So he sends them out on their way, and they don't get very far till Joseph sends his servants after him, and he tells them to go search their bags, and if anybody's stolen anything, to bring them back. Well, they go and they search their bags, and the last bag they search is Benjamin's, and there inside the bag is Joseph's silver cup. So they arrest them all and they bring them back to Joseph, and he says, "Why did you steal from me? I brought you in and I gave you a feast, and this is how you repay me? I'm going to keep Benjamin as a slave. You can go back to your father, but he's my slave now." He wanted to see what they would react. How would these brothers react to this thing? They're about to lose their father's new favorite son. Judah comes in and he falls down before Joseph and he begs him, "Please take me. Let Benjamin go back to my father. If he doesn't go back, my father will die. Take me as a slave instead." At this point, Joseph couldn't take it anymore. He loved his brothers so much, he wanted to reveal himself to them. He's about to cry, and he sends out all of the Egyptians from him. And he talks to his brothers and he says, "Brothers, I am Joseph. I'm your brother who you sold as a slave." His brothers were completely shocked and speechless. They couldn't say anything. They didn't know what to do. This guy who's been kind of rough treating them, he's their brother who they sold as a slave. If he ordered them killed, that could happen right now. He told them, "Don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you." And that's where our verse is from today. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about, as it is this day, to save many people alive. Joseph recognized that even though his brothers had meant to do him harm, God still had a plan through this whole thing. If Joseph had not gone to Egypt and been a slave, if Joseph had not been faithful, if Joseph had not been able to tell Pharaoh his dreams and been put in charge of the land, how many people would have starved to death? Thousands and thousands. The Egyptians would have starved. The people in Canaan would have starved. His own family would have starved. But God had a plan to save all these people alive by bringing Joseph through difficult times to where he wanted him to be. Joseph then sent his brothers back with wagons to get his father, and he brought everything they owned back to Egypt. He was so excited to see his dad. Jacob and Joseph were finally reunited. They hugged each other and cried. Joseph then was able to give his family some of the best land in Canaan, the land of Goshen, where they could raise sheep and goats, and they could really grow, and their families got bigger and bigger and bigger, and God blessed them. Whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, however right or wrong it is, how much we deserve it or not, if we're faithful, God has a plan, and God can use us to make everything better and make the world a better place. So that's it for our story about Joseph. Next week we will begin looking at Moses, and he will come on the scene and begin leading the people of Israel. Since Bubbles did such a good job today, I think he deserves a bowl of cereal. Okay, Bubbles, here you go. All right, thanks for watching. We'll see you guys next time. I'm gonna help Bubbles finish his cereal. Wow. Got a little something on your chin there, buddy.